John Adams is called the father of American independence. He was the second president of the United States. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was a part of the Constitutional Convention, and he said the following: "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Adams and so many others, after having seen the providential hand of God move on behalf of America over and over again, they knew that the establishment of a government had to make room for that providential God. More than 150 years will pass before the descendants of the Pilgrims will finally unite with the English colonists to challenge the British Empire, and they will achieve independence. During those 5 generations, it would be profound changes in wealth and values and occupations and communication and political philosophy and even some theological points. But one characteristic consistently connected the Pilgrims of 1620 to the Patriots of 1776, and that was a convincing mindset that there was a divine ordination and a divine plan for the country they were building. On July 3rd, 1775, George Washington arrives in Philadelphia to take control of the New England forces, which they now call the Continental Army. When he first sees the army that he has, he tells his military aide, Joseph Reed, that he would not have accepted this command if he had known the perilous position in which he found himself. His only hope, he confided, would involve the necessary intervention of a higher power. George Washington said, "If I shall be able to rise superior to these and many other difficulties which might be enumerated, I shall most religiously believe that the finger of providence is to blind the eyes of the enemies." So in order for him to succeed and for this colonial army to win, the finger of providence has to blind the eyes of the British, and that is exactly what God did. In this session, I want us to look at 2 battles. Now, these are indicative and representative of many of the conflicts that occurred during the American Revolution, and these 2 show intervening acts of God, things that some people might say are coincidence or luck or a happenstance. But when you really look at them and put them in context, you can see the providential hand of God was working in the history of America as our nation is being founded. The first one, in May of 1775, Washington decided he would make a daring raid on Fort Ticonderoga, which was in upstate New York. On the day of that attack, Reverend William Gordon wrote this: "A finer night for working could not have been taken out of the whole 365. It was hazy below so that our people could not be seen. Even though a bright moonlit night shone above the hills." Now remember, Washington has prayed for basically the finger of God to blind the eyes of the British. And on that night in May, as the Patriots are up on the hill maneuvering cannons and things that they need for the battle, the Reverend said a haze came in between them and the British down in the valley. So that above the haze, above the fog, the moon shined bright and they could do all the work they needed to do, but the British never saw anything that was happening. And the next morning, the British troops awoke, looked up in horror to see that they were surrounded by cannons and a newly constructed fortification that was glaring down at them. One British officer, in reporting this incident to a London newspaper, said this: "This morning at daybreak, we discovered 2 redoubts. Those are military fortifications on the hills of Dorchester Point and 2 smaller works on their flanks. They were all raised during the night with an expedition equal to that of the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp, from these hills that commanded the whole town, so that we must either drive them from the post or desert the place." He equated what happened with something magical, with something miracle. It would have required the help of the genie that was in Aladdin's lamp in order for the colonial army to be able to pull this off. In other words, the providential hand of God had blinded the eyes of the enemy. The British commander, General William Howe, made the decision that the situation they were in, that they would attack, and they would attack before noon the next day. He had reinforcements that were going to be provided by the Royal Navy. They would be coming in through Boston Harbor. Now, John Trimble, who is a minister, is sitting above watching all of this happening from the top of these hills. So he's able to report and transcribe everything that happens over the next several hours. Washington had visited the troops earlier in the evening, and then he left the area. As soon as Washington left, Trimble reports, the weather changed dramatically. Without warning and out of nowhere, a fierce storm arose. The storm was so strong it shattered windows in the town and it knocked down fences throughout the region. But it also blew the British transport ships that were bringing in the reinforcements out of the water, and they ran aground on the shore. Thus, they're unable to deliver the assault force and the reinforcements to their assigned destination. In the harbor, British ships got torn from their moorings from the dock and crashed into each other. On the higher ground above the port, sleet made the ground so slippery that the British troops could not ascend the slope in order to attack the American forces that were on the top of the hill. The British general, again, William Howe, had no choice but to call off the attack, which allowed the Americans to continue strengthening their positions, which resulted in the British forces evacuating the town under a white flag of retreat. The British general sent a message to George Washington. If the colonials allowed His Majesty's forces to depart from the city without firing upon them or impeding their departure, they would leave Boston without burning it to the ground. The Americans won a major victory and recaptured a major city and a major port of Boston, all unharmed because of fog, wind, and sleet. That event 250 years ago, you may interpret it differently, but the people of that day and time who were there, they defined it as the providential act of the hand of God. The news of the victory spread quickly through the colonies, and Abigail Adams, John's wife, wrote to him and said, "The more I think of it, the more amazed I am that they should leave such a harbor, such fortifications, such entrenchments, and that we should be in peaceable possession of a town which we expected would cost us a river of blood." The following Sunday, George Washington is attending church services where the Reverend Abel Leonard is the minister, and he selected a passage from Exodus 14, verses 24 and 25 as the theme of his sermon. That passage reads, "Now it came to pass in the morning watch that the Lord looked down upon the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud. He troubled the army of the Egyptians, and he took off their chariot wheels, so that they drove them with difficulty. And the Egyptians said, 'Let us flee from the face of Israel, for the Lord fights for them against the Egyptians.'" The mindset of Reverend Leonard was the mindset of everyone in the colonies. The belief of God's intervention was so strong among all the colonies that after this battle, and they're writing the Declaration of Independence, they add this last sentence to the Declaration of Independence. "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Now, let's look at one more battle. This is the battle for Long Island. On July 4th, 1776, we know the Declaration of Independence is signed. It's put into action. This is the first battle that happens after the Declaration of Independence, and it's in August. And it looks like the Declaration of Independence is going to become a useless document, a waste of paper. In this battle for Long Island, the British have outnumbered and outmaneuvered the American patriots. A Pennsylvania private by the name of Michael Graham recalled the misery of the retreat from Long Island. It is impossible for me to describe the confusion and horror of the scene. The artillery flying over the horses' backs, our men running in almost every direction, and run which way they would almost sure to meet the British or the Hessians. I escaped and entered a swamp. There was a great many of our men retreating. Some of them were mired and crying to their fellows for God's sake to help them out. But every man was intent on his own safety, and no assistance was rendered. Our soldiers are retreating, just trying to save their own lives, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, outgunned. Now, the Americans at this point in time, they are trapped on the far western corner of Long Island, and there's a huge English force in front of them, and the East River is behind them. There were 4 British warships with a full complement of cannons, making the escape across the water unthinkable, if not unlikely. To make matters worse, the next morning, the weather changed. The skies darkened and the temperatures dropped significantly. In the afternoon, the Americans faced a cold, soaking downpour, which added to their gloom, and there was so much water that was pouring down. The American soldiers were in water up to their waist in the trenches, the defensive trenches that they had dug. Their gunpowder, their muskets, their cartridges, all soaked by the constant rain. But, providentially, the same thunderstorm that caused their discomfort also worked toward their deliverance. With the winds howling from the northeast, the British warships could not sail up the harbor and deliver and surround the Americans. Admiral Richard Howe, who was General William Howe's brother, sent 2 more maneuverable vessels to sail in there, but they also were blown back because of the wind. It was this storm that gave Washington the chance for his troops to cross Brooklyn to New York in their retreat. This crossing represented the only hope from escaping death and or capture by the British. And it was because of the providential hand of God changing the weather. Remember, the disciples said, "Who is this man that commands even the winds and waves?" Now, Washington gave the order to confiscate every boat in the area to transport his army across the river. This would require a great deal of secrecy and deception. So Washington kept his plan secret from even most of his officers because he didn't want anyone to find out or to let a spy find out and the word to get out. The soldiers in the front lines were instructed to maintain the fires burning all night and to keep up conversations to convince the British they were still there at that point. But the movement that they were doing was detected by an elderly woman who was faithful to England and faithful to King George. So she dispatched her trusted black servant to cross the American lines and to alert General Howe. Now, the servant made it safely into British-controlled territory, but as he rushed to approach the headquarters, a Hessian officer stopped him and intercepted him. The messenger made every attempt to explain to the German Hessian, the mercenaries that the British had hired to help them fight the colonists, to explain what his mission was. But the Hessian, being German, couldn't understand English. In addition to that, seeing the man standing in front of him was a black man, he assumed they were part of the Continental Army because there was over 5,000 black men who were part of the Continental Army. So instead of warning the British commander of what was occurring, the Americans were able to escape without the British knowing until it was too late. Was it just a coincidence that the German Hessian was at that place at that point in time when the servant was crossing that area? Well, the problems for the colonial army is not over just yet in this battle. You see, the steady winds that prevented the British ships from sailing up the East River, which provided time for George Washington to escape. But however, at dawn, a substantial portion of the retreating colonial army was still on the Brooklyn docks. And as the sun was coming up, it would have made them prime targets because the British would have been able to see what was happening from where they were at. So in the clear light of the early morning, without the cover of the rain, without the storm, they would be easy targets for the enemy. However, once again, historian and author David McCullough, in his landmark book, 1776, he writes about this event and he says this: "Incredibly, yet again, circumstances, fate, luck, providence, the hand of God, as will be said so often, intervened. Just at daybreak, a heavy fog settled in over the whole of Brooklyn, concealing everything just as if it was still dark. Even with the sun up, the fog remained as dense as ever, while over the New York side of the river, there was no fog at all. So the fog covered the British from seeing, and they were able to escape the colonial army. They were able to escape, and there was no fog on their side of the river." A major in the colonial army named Talmadge wrote this: "In the history of warfare, I do not recollect a more fortunate retreat. After all, The providential appearance of the fog saved a part of our army from being captured, and certainly myself among others who formed the rear guard. Later, after all the colonial army had escaped and the British realized what had happened, the British came to where the American fortress positions were, and the history records that they could not find as much as a biscuit or a glass of rum wherewith to console themselves. Events that somehow explain away coincidence, accidental good fortune, or luck. But the colonists were not convinced. They were convinced it was providence. A colonial army of patriots, suited with muskets that were better for rabbit hunting than for warfare. It was David versus Goliath all over again. And once again, the hand of God guided the smooth stone of the patriots to an unbelievable victory toward ultimate independence.